She buried his father and ruled his kingdom for 2 years. Then the Alpha King returned and saw a stranger on his throne. A story in one part. Part 1. The funeral she ran alone. The morning they buried the old king, it rained the way it always rains in the north. Not hard, not soft, but steady. Like it had decided to rain and had no intention of stopping for anyone's grief. Saren stood at the head of the grave and counted the wolves in the crowd. 312. She knew because she had approved every name on the attendance list herself. 3 nights ago, sitting at the king's desk with ink on her fingers and a candle burning low enough to be a fire hazard, she had crossed out 2 names. Wolves who had made noise, the dangerous kind of noise, the kind that travels, and written 2 alternatives in their place. That had been her first real act of governance. She was 24 years old. She had been married for 6 months, to a man she saw 9 times before he disappeared. She was about to lower a crown onto a dead man's coffin in front of 300 wolves who were watching her hands for shaking. Her hands did not shake. That was the thing about Saren. The worse it got, the stiller she got. The ceremony was long. The Northern rites always were. 3 calls, 3 silences, the naming of lineage going back 7 generations, the howling that started low and built until the gray sky felt like it was pressing down on all of them. Saren had practiced the Northern words until she could say them without thinking. She said them now without feeling, which was different, but the wolves couldn't tell the difference from where they stood. When the moment came, the moment she had dreaded, the moment she had rehearsed 4 times in her private rooms, she stepped forward. The crown was cold in her hands, heavier than it looked. Of course it was. She placed it on the lid of the coffin, not on her own head. That part matters. She was not claiming anything. She was only completing a ritual that had no one else to complete it. The king's son was gone, missing, declared dead by the council 6 weeks ago, though she had never said those words herself and had quietly instructed her people not to say them either. But the crowd looked at her hands releasing the crown, and they saw a declaration. She saw it on their faces, the calculation that passed through 300 wolves in under a second, like light hitting water. Who is she? What is she now? Can we follow her? Should we? She gave them nothing to decide against. She stood straight, folded her hands in front of her, and waited for the soil to be moved. The white gloves were already in the ground. She had slipped them into the coffin before the lid was sealed, tucked them beside the old king's left hand, the one that had always been a little cold, the one he'd held out to her the morning they first met. He had pressed those gloves into her hands that morning like a man returning something borrowed. She had never figured out what they meant. She buried him in them because she had no better idea what else to do with them. She didn't tell anyone. Some things are not for 300 wolves to know. The council met that evening. She had already drafted the agenda. They sat around the long table in the war room. 12 wolves, some of them her late father-in-law's men, some of them neutral, 2 of them hers, which was a number she intended to change, and looked at her the way people look at something they haven't decided how to classify yet. She was not, technically, family. Her marriage to the absent king's son had been sealed but not fully consummated in any political sense that the pack would recognize. She was a treaty bride, a piece of diplomacy in a dress. She sat at the head of the table because there was no one else to sit there, and she opened the meeting. They let her. That was the first mistake they made. Part 2. 2 years of learning to be unmovable. The first coup attempt came 47 days into her regency. She had known it was coming for 11 days. She had 3 wolves working inside the network of the Lord who was planning it. A man called Varen, broad and loud and convinced that the pack would follow noise if the noise was confident enough. He had underestimated her intelligence channels, and he had also, more fatally, underestimated how little she slept. She had him removed before dawn on the day he had planned to move. Quietly, no spectacle, just gone, reassigned to the eastern border outpost, which was cold and damp and far enough from the capital that his noise couldn't travel. The second attempt was from a different direction, a coalition. 3 lords, 1 female alpha who had wanted the seat herself, and a human diplomat who had miscalculated where the power was sitting. They had been more careful. She had still known about it for 16 days. By the third attempt she had stopped being surprised. What surprised her, in the slow way that realizations surface when you're too busy to look for them, was something else entirely. She had stopped being afraid. Not because the danger was less. The danger was, in an objective sense, significantly greater by month 7. Her position was contested, her authority was technically provisional, and there were wolves in 3 territories who would have been very pleased to wake up and find her gone. The threat was real. She knew it the way she knew the weather, not as something to fear, just as conditions to account for. She started running the patrols differently, smarter. She restructured the intelligence network, not tearing it down, but rewiring it, building in redundancies, naming a second contact for every informant in case the first one went quiet. She brokered a trade agreement with the river clans that her late father-in-law had been trying and failing to close for a decade. She closed it in 3 weeks by reading the room and offering the thing they actually wanted, which was not the thing they had been asking for. She found, to her own quiet discomfort, that she was good at this. One evening, this was month 11, deep into winter, snow on every window, she caught herself in the mirror while she was dressing for a council meeting. She was wearing the formal northern coat, the charcoal one, with the silver buttons that had been made for her arrival, and had felt like a costume back then. She was standing the way the old king used to stand, back straight, chin up, hands loose. She stood there for a moment and looked at herself and felt something that had no clean name. It was not pride, it was not grief, it was something in between, the particular weight of becoming someone you hadn't planned on being. She went to the meeting, she ran it, she always ran it. There was a map on the desk in the study. She had inherited it, technically. It had been the old king's map, and before him his father's, a large rolled parchment of the territory with handwritten notes in a particular cramped hand that she recognized from the letters she had been given when she arrived. The hand was not the old king's. It was his son's, Calder's. She had found the map in the first week and unrolled it and read all his notes. She had then started adding her own, in a different ink, not consciously marking the difference. It had just happened that way, her pen being a different color, the distinction appearing on its own. His notes in faded brown, hers in dark blue, his in the margins, hers layering in around them. By month 18 she had run out of his margins to fill. She started writing in the spaces he'd left between territories, between roads, in the white gaps where he'd left room for things he intended to come back to. Her personal guard was a man called Draven. He had been the old king's choice, not hers, but he was effective, and she had found no reason to replace him, which was its own kind of recommendation. He was large, mostly silent, and had a habit of appearing in doorways without making noise that she had stopped finding unsettling sometime around month 4. One morning, early spring of the 2nd year, frost still on the ground, she was standing at the study window reviewing a report, and he came in with tea and stayed in the room a beat too long. She said, without turning around, "What do you want to ask?" He set the tea down, paused. "Who are you ruling for, my lady?" She turned around. He met her eyes without flinching, a thing she had learned to respect in him. "The kingdom," she said. "I know that," he said. He meant, who else? She looked at him for a long moment. The fire in the hearth was the only sound in the room. "Go check the Eastern Patrol schedule," she said. "The rotation is wrong." He left. She turned back to the window and stood there for a while looking at the frost on the grass and not thinking about the question. Not thinking about it very deliberately, with the kind of discipline she had built over 2 years of not thinking about things that had no useful answer. Outside, far below, a wolf she didn't recognize was crossing the courtyard. She watched him until he disappeared through the gate. Part 3. The Rumor Before the Man. The report came on a Tuesday. It was written in the clipped shorthand of the Northern Scouts. She had learned to read it herself, had insisted on being the first reader, not because she distrusted her advisors, but because she had learned that summary always loses something, and it said, in 8 words that she read 3 times, possible sighting, northern border. Description does not match records. Records, in this context, meant the portrait in the East Corridor, the one the old king had commissioned 3 years ago, when Calder had been 17 and was already, by the portrait's account, built like something the old world had carved out of rock and left to weather into a person. She folded the report. She unfolded it. She folded it again and set it on the edge of the desk. Then she called for her war room advisors. They arrived within the hour. 7 wolves, her 2 most trusted intelligence handlers, and the head of Border Patrol, a woman called Neve who was methodical and calm, and who had, Saren had noticed, started referring to Saren as my lady instead of the regent, sometime in the last 3 months, which was the kind of small shift that meant something. Saren put the report on the table. She watched them read it. She had spent 2 years learning to watch rooms, not just listening to what was said, but reading what happened in the small muscles of people's faces when they processed information. She could tell by the way Neve's jaw tightened that the scout's description had been passed around verbally before it reached paper. She could tell by the way 2 of the lords were careful not to look at her that they had already discussed what it would mean. One of them, young, ambitious, the kind of young that hasn't learned yet what it costs to say things aloud, looked up from the report and said, "If it is the king, the regency ends." The room went quiet. Not because the statement was wrong. It was not wrong. It was a straightforward reading of the legal situation. The room went quiet because of what Saren did not do. She did not flinch. She did not look relieved. She did not look afraid. Her face gave them nothing, not because she had nothing to give, but because she had long ago built a wall between what was happening on her face and what was happening below it. She said, "We verify the sighting. We do not announce. We send 2 of our best to the northern border, with instructions to observe and report, not engage." She said, "We proceed as normal until we know what normal is." She said all of this without moving. And under the table, where no one could see it, she turned the carved wolf signet ring on her right hand. Once, the cool metal against her finger, the familiar weight of it, she had worn it on her right hand since the day she took the throne, not the left. The left hand was where a different ring would have gone, if she and Calder had ever been properly anything, if 6 months had been enough time to become something. She had never been sure. She wasn't sure now. The ring turned once under the table. One of the lords noticed. She saw him notice. She looked at him until he looked away. The scouts came back in 4 days. The description matched. She read the report in her private rooms at 11 at night with Draven standing at the door and a fire that was burning too low to be worth looking at. She read it twice. She set it down. She went to the window and looked at the dark. He was alive. He was at the northern border. He had been held. The scouts had pieced together fragments from border settlements, stories that had circulated without context, in a prison 2 territories over, the kind of prison that didn't have its name on any official document. He had gotten out. He had walked home. She thought, he walked home. She was not sure what she felt about that. The thought kept circling without landing. She told Draven to arrange a quiet escort. No announcement. No ceremony. Not yet. She went to bed. She did not sleep. Part 4. He walks back in. She was in the war room when they brought him through the gates. She knew it was him before anyone told her. She heard the change in the courtyard, the particular silence that falls when a pack recognizes something it thought it had lost. 300 wolves, and the whole compound went still. She stayed in the war room for 4 minutes. She counted. Then she went down. The great hall was half lit. It was late afternoon, winter light, the kind that falls sideways through tall windows and turns everything amber. He was standing in the center of the room. Her escort had brought him in and then, very wisely, had found places to be on the edges of the room, leaving a wide, clear space between the doors and where he stood. She walked in. She stopped. He was thinner than the portrait, not in a way that looked wrong, in a way that looked like a man who had been stripped back to what was essential. The portrait had shown a 17-year-old boy with the same bones but more softness. This was not that. This was the bones without the softness. There was a scar on the left side of his jaw, that the portrait did not have. She catalogued that in under a second. She didn't know why she noted it first. She did. He was looking at the room, not at her, at the room, taking it in. She watched him see the changes she had made, the new banners, the repositioned council table, the painting on the eastern wall she had moved from the corridor because it had better light in here. He was reading her work the way you read a room you used to know. Then he looked at her. He said her name, just her name, nothing attached to it, no title, no my lady, no regent, just Saren, said quietly, the way you say something you've been saying in private for a long time. The escort on the edges of the room heard a king addressing a regent. She heard something she did not have a name for, something that landed below the level of thought. She said, "My lord." He crossed the distance between them. She didn't move. He stopped 3 feet away, close enough that she could see the details the portrait hadn't caught. The way his eyes were a different quality of watchful than she'd expected, not calculating, just present, like he was actually in the room, like he was actually looking at her. "The council," she said. "I should convene. Tomorrow," he said. "The border reports from this week need review before—" "Tomorrow," he said again. She stopped. He was still looking at her. She had spent 2 years being looked at by wolves, who were trying to find something to use against her. This was not that. She didn't know what it was. The not knowing sat in her chest like a stone. "You should eat," she said, "and rest. I'll have rooms prepared." She turned and walked out. She made it to the corridor before she allowed herself to stop walking and press her back against the cold stone wall and just stand there, breathing. He had come back. 2 years of building herself on the premise of his absence, and he had come back. Everything she had made here, the intelligence network, the border agreements, the map with her notes layered over his, was built on the foundation of his not being here. She breathed. She straightened. She went to arrange the rooms. Part 5. The argument that isn't about the throne. They met in the study the following evening. She had chosen the study deliberately. Not the throne room, not the war room, the study, which was private enough for honesty and formal enough that neither of them could pretend this wasn't political. She had the map rolled to one side and the relevant legal documents on the desk because there was, genuinely and technically, a legal question to resolve. A regent's authority dissolved upon the return of the rightful ruler. That was the law. The law, however, had not anticipated a regent who had remade the territory in 2 years. The law did not have language for the case, where the interim administration had signed 47 treaties, restructured 3 border agreements, and built an intelligence architecture that was more sophisticated than anything the territory had operated on before. The law, in short, was inadequate, which was why they were in the study. He sat across from her. She poured water, neither of them touched it, and they began. It went professionally for about 20 minutes. They talked about the treaties. They talked about transition timelines. He asked questions and she answered them, clearly and thoroughly, because she had spent 2 years learning to give clear and thorough answers to questions she had not been asked yet. He did not push back. He did not minimize. He listened the way a man listens when he is actually listening, not just waiting for the next space in the conversation. Then he said, "You could have sent for help." She looked at him. "I'm sorry?" "In the 2nd year, the 3rd coup attempt. You were managing an intelligence operation with 4 handlers and a budget that wasn't designed for it. You could have called in—" "From who?" she said. 2 words. They fell between them like a verdict. The silence that followed was long enough to become its own kind of conversation. She had not meant to say it that way. She had meant to say it as a practical observation. There had been no reliable external ally. The adjacent territories had been in their own crises. The options were not what they appeared. She had meant to say it as information, but what came out was, "From who?" And what it carried was, "You were not here. You were declared dead. I built this alone because alone was what I had, and I built it out of materials that were available, and the materials that were available were my own hands, and my own intelligence, and whatever I could pull from the people I had managed to make trust me, and I would like you to understand what that cost, except I do not have language for it that isn't also an accusation, and I do not want to accuse you of being held captive in a foreign prison, which is obviously not a choice you made." She said none of that. She said from who, and left the rest of it in the air. He was quiet. He looked at the map for a long moment, at her notes layered over his, the dark blue over the faded brown, 2 years of her handwriting filling in his silences. He said, "I know." She said, "Do you?" The candle between them had burned most of the way down. The room was dimmer than it had been when they started. Neither of them had reached to light another. They sat in the near dark for a while. Eventually she gathered the papers and said goodnight. He let her go. Part 6. The court takes sides. The council session was 3 days later. Full council, all 12 members, plus the observers from the outer territories who had traveled in for the occasion. It was the first formal session since his return. He sat at the head of the table. She sat to his right. That arrangement had taken her 4 minutes of private deliberation, and she was still not entirely sure it was correct. The meeting began with reports. Routine. She had briefed him the night before on everything that needed briefing, so he moved through the reports with the fluency of someone who had been given the information and had the intelligence to absorb it quickly. The council, she noticed, was watching him the way they had once watched her, not with hostility, but with the particular assessment of people who are deciding where the weight of a room is going to fall. Lord Pren, the most senior member of the council, the most calculating, a man who had been present at every transition of power in this territory for 30 years, and who had a talent for identifying the moment when the balance shifted and positioning himself on the right side of it before anyone else noticed it moving, said, in a tone of elaborate reasonableness, that the legal question of the Regency transition raised certain concerns about continuity. He was not wrong. He then said, with the same elaborate reasonableness, that the prolonged absence of a ruler, 2 years, in this case, raised questions about the continuity of pack authority. He was pushing at something. She could see it. The room could see it. He was testing how far he could go. He said, "Some voices in the outer territories have suggested that a formal challenge might be appropriate, to re-establish the legitimacy of the Alpha claim after so extended a period of—" Calder said nothing. The room waited. He waited 3 seconds, not long, but long enough to make Pren finish his sentence with a small, visible loss of nerve, and then he said, "My regent held what I couldn't hold. She held it for 2 years, and she held it well. If you have questions about the legitimacy of this seat, address them to her. She's the one who kept it." The room went very still. Saren felt the stillness touch her from every direction at once. 12 wolves recalibrating. She said nothing. She kept her face the way she had learned to keep it, but she had heard what he had said. Not, "The Regency was provisional," and not, "She kept things stable while I was gone." He had said she held what he couldn't hold. He had said to address questions of legitimacy to her, in front of 12 witnesses and 6 observers. Pren sat back. The challenge, such as it was, dissolved into the meeting's remaining business. So, she set the relevant ledger on the table. 2 years of decisions, treaties, executions, pardons, marriages brokered, wars averted, all of it organized and dated and cross-referenced, and they worked through the transition documentation for the rest of the afternoon as if it were paperwork, which it was. It was also something else. She didn't look at him. He didn't look at her. They both looked at the ledger. Part 7. The quiet in between. It happened by accident, the way the real things usually do. She had been in the study late. The 10th consecutive night she had been in the study late, working through the transition documents that were taking 3 times as long as she had estimated, and she had fallen asleep at the desk, which was not something she had meant to do. She woke to the sound of someone moving in the room. She sat up. He was standing at the window. He had a cup of something. Tea, she thought, from the smell, and he was looking at the dark outside with the particular quality of attention of a man who is not actually looking at the dark. He said, without turning around, "Sorry, I didn't mean to wake you." She said, "You didn't." He turned around. He looked at her, at the papers spread under her arms, the ink still on her fingers, the evidence of the last 3 hours, and he said, "You work too late." "So do you," she said. He looked at the map. He crossed to the desk and stood over it, reading her notes the way he had been reading them since he returned, carefully, with the attention of someone who is learning a language they almost know. His handwriting was in the margins of the old sections. Hers was everywhere else. He said, "Your notation system is better than mine." She said, "I had more time." He was quiet. She looked at him, looking at the map, and felt something uncomfortable move through her. Not quite guilt, not quite grief, something that combined elements of both without being either. She had been writing over his work for 2 years, building over it, making it hers. She had done it because there was no other option and the territory needed it done, but standing next to him in the near dark of the study, she felt the fact of it in a different way. "The Eastern annotations," he said, "the Border Patrol restructure. This was yours?" "Yes." "The incident in month 14, the Varon situation, it's not in the formal records." "No," she said. "I kept it separate. The documentation exists, but it's not in the council archive. I thought it was better that way." He nodded slowly. He was thinking something. She could see him thinking it, but she couldn't read what it was. He said, "You were protecting someone." She said, "I was protecting several people, and the territory, and the long-term stability of a council that needed to function without old grudges turning into new feuds." He looked at her. "Yes," he said. "Obviously." She looked back at him. The fire had burned low. The room was warm anyway. Outside the window, the dark was starting to thin at the edges. It was later than she had thought. He reached out and picked up the ring. Not from her hand. It was on the desk, where she had set it hours ago, a habit she had developed without noticing, setting it down when she worked late, picking it up again when she left. He picked it up and held it in his palm and looked at it. The carved wolf, the silver that had gone warm from her hand. He did not speak. She did not speak. He set it back down, carefully, in exactly the place it had been. She looked at the ring and then at him, and the question that the moment contained went unanswered. She could feel it hanging in the air between them, open, unresolved, the way things between them had a habit of being. He said, "Get some sleep." She said, "Go away." But she said it without force, and he left without hurry. She sat in the study for a while longer after he was gone. She did not touch the ring, but she looked at it for a long time. Part 8. The Choice and What It Costs. The formal session was set for the following week. Full court, every lord who could travel, the 6 observers from the outer territories, the allied delegation from the river clans who had come in for the transition and who were, she knew, also here to see which way the power settled, because that would determine how they continued to relate to this territory. The legal question had been resolved quietly in the days between. She had drafted the documentation herself, a thorough piece of legal work, comprehensive, covering every edge case, and she and Calder had reviewed it together in 2 sessions that were entirely professional and in which neither of them referenced the study, the ring, the candle, or the night it had burned down to nothing. The law allowed for 2 resolutions. 1. Full restoration of the Alpha King's sole authority, with the regency formally dissolved and her position revised to advisory. 2. Formal investiture of co-sovereignty, a classification the Northern Code permitted, but which had never in this territory's history actually been used. They had not discussed which option he intended to take. She had not asked. He had not said. The documentation covered both paths, and she had prepared both sets of ceremonial language, and she had arrived at the morning of the session without knowing which set of papers would come out of the folder. This was, she recognized, a remarkable level of trust for a woman who trusted very few things she could not personally verify. She recognized it. She did not examine it. The hall was full. She stood to his right, 3 feet back, the traditional position of a regent in formal session, and watched the room fill and settle. She watched Pren take his seat and arrange his face into something carefully neutral. She watched Neve, across the room, catch her eye and give her the smallest possible nod. The session opened. Calder spoke for 20 minutes. He addressed the absence, directly, without elaboration, without apology, in the plain language of a man who has decided that the facts are what they are. He addressed the territory's condition during his absence, and he used specific language that she recognized from the ledger, the treaty records, the restructured patrol schedules. He had read all of it. He had read all of it and remembered it. The room listened. She listened. He said, 2 years ago, I left this territory in a situation I did not choose. What was held in my absence was not held by luck or by inertia. It was held by decision, every day, by a regent who operated without the resources or the authority she should have had, and who built both from what was available. He paused. The Northern Code allows for co-sovereignty in exceptional circumstances. The documentation is before you. I am formally requesting your recognition of Seren as co-sovereign of this territory, with equal standing, equal authority, and equal claim. The hall was quiet, the way large spaces go quiet when what has just happened takes a moment to land. She had prepared herself for this possibility. She had drafted the documentation for it. She had read the precedent, all 4 cases in the Northern Historical Record, none of them in this territory. She had thought about it with the same clear, methodical attention she brought to anything she needed to survive. She had not prepared for the way he said her name. He turned to her, turned away from the court, turned to face her directly, and he said her name again, the same way he had said it the day he walked back in. Not Regent, not my lady, Seren, the private way, the way you say something you've been saying alone, in front of 300 wolves. The hall went still. She did not move. The crown was on her head. She had worn it for the formal session as the regent, as she always wore it for full court, and he did not touch it, did not reach for it, did not make any gesture toward removing it or replacing it or adding to it. He left it exactly where it was. In the Northern Code, that meant something specific. She knew what it meant. The hall was waiting. She looked at him, at the scar on his jaw, at the eyes that were actually looking at her, at the space between them that was 3 feet and also everything, and she felt something settle in her chest that had been moving for a long time. Not landing, not resolving, just settling, the way water settles, still carrying everything it carried before, but still, she did not speak. The court read her silence correctly. The court had spent 2 years learning to read her silences. Later, much later, when the formal session had concluded and the lords had filed out and the observers had been escorted to their quarters, she stood alone in the throne room. The hall was empty, the banners hung without moving. The fire had been banked low for the night, and everything was amber and shadow. She stood where she had been standing when he turned to face her. The crown was still on her head. She thought about taking it off. She thought about the weight of it, literal weight, the cold metal, the years she had learned to carry it without thinking about the weight. She thought about the gloves in the ground. She thought about the map with her handwriting over his. She thought about a candle burning down in the dark and neither of them moving to light another. She thought about, from who? 2 words she had said without meaning to say them, that had carried everything she hadn't said for 2 years, and he had heard them and said, I know. Do you? She had said, and he had not answered. He had looked at the map, and then, a week later, he had said her name in front of 300 wolves, the way you say something you've been saying in private for a long time. She stood in the empty hall. Her hands were at her sides. The crown was on her head. Outside the tall windows, the night was clear and cold and full of stars. She did not take the crown off. She stood there for a while longer, breathing, feeling the stone floor under her feet, the weight of the crown, the particular silence of a room that has just held 300 people and is now holding only 1. And then she walked toward the door. She did not walk away from the throne. She walked toward wherever he was, which was the same thing now, or it was becoming the same thing. She couldn't yet tell where the line was between the two. That was something she would figure out. She was good at figuring things out. End of story.